last several lectures, we've considered some of the themes that have been predominant in Western approaches to philosophical issues. As I pointed out, these aren't universally accepted by Western thinkers, but on the whole, these are basic tendencies. One of these is a tendency to look for some explanation of the world that we see around us, the changing world, in terms of some basic substance or substances, something that is conceived of as fundamentally unchanging. Along with this is the idea that what's unchanging or permanent, the eternal, is more true and more fundamentally real than what does change, even though we see change all around us. We also considered the way that mind and body are understood in Western thought. On the whole, mind and body have been thought to be distinct kinds of things, creating a problem philosophically as to how you explain the way mind and body work together. The individual person is considered to be, in fact, an individual. The notion of being a person is not something that's held to be a matter of being in a collective of some sort. Instead, the notion is that to be as a person is mainly to have an individual soul of some sort, or an individual mind. Although we haven't really stressed the nature of time in Western thought, I think many of us are aware of the fact that time is thought to be something linear. St. Augustine, for example, described time in terms of three phases: the past, the present, and the future. For most of us in the West, this sounds fairly familiar. And what this is a theory of time that does not have any kind of cyclical aspect to it. We don't, for the most part in the West, have the idea that time circles back on itself. Though, as we'll see, this is not an uncommon presupposition in the world at all. Finally, we've talked about reason as being the premier way of finding out the truth, according to Western philosophers. Reason has been seen as the way to determine how to live, as well as the way to determine what's fundamentally true. In this lecture, I'm going to point out that although these themes may seem extremely common to us, in fact, they're not only philosophical presuppositions in an abstract sense, but for many of us, philosophical presuppositions in our everyday life, nevertheless, these are not universal themes. People in other parts of the world have sometimes had very different presuppositions as they started thinking about reality. The example I'm going to give in this particular lecture is the worldview of the Yoruba tribe which lives primarily in Nigeria. Yoruba beliefs contrast with the various themes we've talked about in connection with Western thought, and we'll proceed to consider exactly what the Yoruba do think on these very issues. First of all, let's consider the idea that the world is primarily a matter of substances. This is the Western view, but the Yoruba do not assume that explanation in terms of basically inert substances is an explanation at all. Instead, the Yoruba, like many of the other tribes in the sub-Saharan African region, tend to think that the world is mainly made up of forces. And force is understood as something active. To have force is to have the power to make things happen. The supreme case of force has to do with the supreme god, Olorun, who is felt to have the maximal power to make things happen. But in lesser ways, human beings have force. Animals have force. Other natural beings have force. In fact, artworks have force. Now, force is something that not only has the power to affect states of affairs, but force can be conveyed from one being to another. In fact, human beings and animals and trees, etc., only have force because Olorun has conveyed force to them. Olorun, the supreme god, is understood to be very distant. I think this contrasts with a theme, at least in most of the religions of the West. Although one might say that we too consider God to be someone whose being is very different in terms of perfection from ours. But there's a sense in the Yoruba religion that Olorun's distance is a reason not to worship Olorun directly. Olorun has a kind of power and there's a gap between us. And so instead of directly worshiping Olorun, the Yoruba typically worship something that might be called deputy gods, orissas. And the idea of worshiping the orissas might be compared a little bit to the idea of praying to a saint in Catholicism. That instead of going directly to God, having an intermediary who's a little bit closer to God than we are might be a good idea. I remember listening to a radio show on African religions, and a man was interviewed about his views on God. And he said, well, of course I believe in God who created the whole world, and this God is the same as the God that's worshipped everywhere. But he's so far from us, I worship my uncle. We'll talk more about the relationship between religious worldviews and family membership later on. What's assumed here, in other words, is that there are powers, power to act, power to make things happen, power to influence other beings, and these are considered the fundamental things to notice in the world, not forces whose movement you have to explain. What this means then is that the Western notion that change is something that needs to be explained, that the normal state of affairs is inertness until something moves things, is not presupposed at all. Everything is already supposed to be moving in the Yoruba way of looking at things. The Yoruba interpretation of mind and body, I think, is rather fascinating from a Western point of view. As we talked about in connection with Descartes, in the West we tend to think of mind as one thing and body as something else. Maybe not every theorist has as extreme a separation as Descartes does, but basically these are two kinds of things that somehow get conjoined in a human being. The Yoruba worldview, by contrast, is much more complicated. If the Western worldview has two kinds of things that get together, in the Yoruba view of things, there are actually several elements. And these are spiritual elements, yet at the same time they correspond to various things that we would call parts of the body. One of these elements is in fact associated with the body. It's called the aura. And in this sense, body is viewed as something like a clay mold in which these other forces are put into the body. In fact, the body is thought to be something that was molded from clay. And into the body comes another spiritual force, the life principle or the breath, called Emi. And this is essential in order to be a living human being. Another force is also absolutely essential, or spiritual element. This is the inner head, which gives us our personality. And as we'll be talking about, it also gives us our destiny. This inner head is called the Ori. And in addition to having this important role in terms of our own destiny, it also connects us with the past. The Ori is thought to be an ancestral guardian spirit. We might compare this in a way to a guardian angel that is with us throughout our lives. Finally, the fourth spiritual element is associated with the legs. This is called the esse, and it's essentially the principle of movement, what enables us to act in such a way that we realize what's already implicit in the inner head. The inner head of these four elements is the most decisive for the way our lives go. One story explains why it is that people's fates end up being so different in terms of the god who makes the inner heads. This god, or an Orisha, is called Ajala, and he's considered to be a potter god who's a little bit careless with his workmanship. So he makes some heads really well, but others not quite so well, and some really not very good at all. As the people that we become, we make a choice before birth as to which head we get. And unfortunately, it's not always very obvious whether this is a good choice or not. Nevertheless, a lot hangs on it. Our destiny is determined by what our inner head is. An alternative story talks more in terms of Olorun, talks of our soul or some aspect of our soul appearing before Olorun before birth and choosing a destiny. In this story, too, Olorun usually granting the destiny requested, there's a sense that a choice is made without all the facts before us. And we might say, well, this is really a kind of odd choice. It's not a choice with much knowledge of what the significance of the choice is. We may realize that a lot hangs on it, but we don't have the relevant information to make a good choice. Now, I think this particular account of the Yoruba, or these two variants of the account of somehow choosing our destiny, is really an issue in a lot of philosophical systems. And I'll point out that in some ways it's comparable to what's thought in the West, even though it's a rather different account. One of the issues that Aristotle considers, for instance, is what do we make of the fact that human beings have character? On the one hand, we feel that it's appropriate to blame people for having the habits that they have. After all, they're the ones who've chosen to act the way they do over and over again. But on the other hand, it does seem that people are born with a certain character, and for some people it's just a lot easier to be good in certain ways. It maybe doesn't seem fair, but nevertheless that's the way it seems. Aristotle's solution to this is to say, well, what we hold people responsible for are the way they work with what they're born with. Indeed, they are born with some traits that are basically going to guide them unless they do something radical to reshape them. But when we talk about someone having good moral character, we're talking about the choices they make in life, given what they've been born with. And in a sense, I think the Yoruba account is trying to deal with these two observed features of our life as well. People do seem to have a personality from the beginning that does dictate in lots of ways what's going to be possible to them through life, but nevertheless we feel that people are responsible for their choices. Now in the Yoruba system, I think that the emphasis is largely on what is determined by the Ori, the fact that destiny is largely dictated in a sense before one is born, but still there's a lot of emphasis on what you can do to work with your destiny. It's considered to be possible to harm a destiny. Indeed, a person could do this themselves by various infractions of taboos or not offering sacrifices to the gods. This, no matter what Ori you're born with, is not going to put you in good stead. Certain kinds of medicines or spells, witchcraft, can also interfere with a destiny's being good. On the other hand, if you offer sacrifices to the gods, even if you weren't born with the best of Oris, the idea is that you might be able to improve your destiny. The gods will at least facilitate your life going forward in its own way, even though the rough outlines are already there. One of the details of this notion of destiny already dictating many things is that destiny is thought to indicate precisely when your time of death is. We in the West often say that it was a person's time when someone dies, or speak of an untimely death. So in a sense, I think that isn't an entirely foreign idea to us. But the notion of the Ori being responsible here is that there's a very precise time that literally is the time when your time is up. And it's possible sometimes for people to die in advance of that, but in a sense, they're kind of left on Earth at that point. They become ghosts who stay here until the time that their destiny dictates actually comes about, and then they go on their further afterlife. Because destiny is something that's largely fixed, actually, it's possible to find out things. And this, I think, is one of the positive features of a very deterministic system. That is, a system in which many things are determined and human freedom isn't really very wide. In other words, it's possible to find out through divination what sorts of things actually are going to make one's life go better. If one is radically free, choices are wide open, and there aren't many things to specify the way your life that should go. Even if you believe in foreknowledge, it's not going to be very helpful probably, because it seems that, again, you have many choices before you. But on the Yoruba scheme, where a lot of choices really aren't choices for you, but were already implicit in choosing your Ori, divination can give you some pretty specific guidance. And there are many systems of divination, the most prominent one being something called the Ifa, which involves use of palm nuts, which are organized into a certain pattern, and that enables the person who is performing this particular kind of divination to decide what particular part of a very long oral text is appropriate. And the idea is somehow to fit whatever the general story in the text is at that point to the person's specific question. So divination is possible because there are, in fact, real things to be known about who you are and how your life is going to go. The notion of being a person for the Yoruba is also rather different than it tends to be in Western thought. In the first place, the idea of being a person is something that is developmental. In other words, you aren't a person right from the start and completely, but instead, as you develop and mature, you become more of a person. To use philosophical terms to describe this, the idea of being a person is both descriptive and prescriptive for the Yoruba. In other words, it both describes what kind of being you are, but it also prescribes or insists upon certain things that are appropriate. So, for example, there's one sense in which we can say a new person is born when a baby arrives into the world. But there's also a sense in which calling someone a person means they've fulfilled certain things. They've developed in a certain appropriate way. You might say that we use the word art in a way that's something like this. If we see a painting on the wall, there's a descriptive sense in which no matter what we think of the painting, we can say, this is art. But a lot of people see paintings on the wall or other things that are sort of near the wall in galleries these days and say, that's not art. Now, they aren't meaning that it doesn't fit the classification in some sense. What they mean is it isn't good art. And for the Yoruba, the idea of being a person is something like this as well. Someone really isn't fully a person until they've taken their place in the community. And that means that a mature person is a full person and in fact has certain kinds of powers or certain kinds of authority simply because of having fulfilled these things. Among the kind of obligations that are required to be a person in a full sense are obligations to the tribe and the family. And this points to a second thing about personhood from the Yoruba point of view. One isn't a person in isolation. The idea of being an individual isn't really what personhood is about so much, but instead it's taking your place, fulfilling a role in a larger society. To be a person is something that has a collective dimension. To fulfill the obligations you need to fulfill in order to be a full person, one needs to consider the whole tribe. And interestingly, the tribe is not just the living members of the tribe, but also the dead members of the tribe, as well as members that are to come. The idea here is that sustaining the tribe and fulfilling the life that the ancestors have given us is a crucial part of fulfilling your role as a human being. So working is considered to be essential to being a full human being. Having children, continuing the tribe in that sense, is also considered to be essential. By comparison with the emphasis that we saw in Kant, for example, talking about obligation, and indeed Kant thought talking in terms of obligation was quite appropriate, what Kant talked about was a matter of fulfilling certain rules or keeping the categorical imperative, not breaking moral rules in that sense. In the Yoruba way of looking at things, it's more a question of practices that one is involved in, not as explicitly particular rules. There are rules, there are certain taboos that ought not be meddled with. But nevertheless, the idea of living a good moral life has to do with engaging in these ongoing practices of working, raising a family, participating in the life of the tribe. Although we have individual oris, the destinies that the oris dictate to us somehow work together when one is alive. So it's not as if one's destiny is something that is completely an individual matter either. Instead, our destinies are linked. And a person's role within the tribe and within the society is something that plays out the destiny but has a lot of influence on the destinies of others. With regard to time, too, the Yoruba think differently than do most philosophers in the West. One of the most striking differences is the belief in reincarnation. The notion is that the same soul can come back to Earth many times, and does do this, in fact, cyclically. There are even some names in Yoruba that indicate this. Babatunde means father returns, and Yetunde means mother returns. And the idea is, quite literally, someone from one's family in the past has been reborn in a new person. And it's not that this is a one-time or just occasional thing, but the idea is that souls are reborn in a fairly regular way. Now, this may seem a rather odd idea, But again, keep in mind that the notion of the family for the Yoruba, and I think this is a very common view in sub-Saharan Africa, the notion of the family extends to the dead. The dead are not excluded from the idea of my family. So the idea of seeing your grandmother again in a new child that's born into the family seems perfectly normal. In fact, this is one of the particularly lovely views, I think, of this particular notion of reincarnation, that, of course, the ancestor spirits would like to be with their family members, so they come back in the same lineage. And that's a typical way for things to work. Time is also considered to be cyclical in a more general sense, in that the flow of nature is cyclical. We see cycles of agriculture. If you just look at the cycles of the seasons, again, there seems to be a kind of circular pattern. And in that sense, too, measuring time is understood in terms of these natural cycles. John Mbiti, a Kenyan theologian, also talks about how many tribes in sub-Saharan Africa talk in terms of time where the distinction that Augustine makes between 3 phases collapses into something more like 2. One time is the time that we're living in roughly right now. But it's not just this pinpoint moment of the present. Many Western thinkers, including Augustine, have been rather startled by the fact that you've got a notion of a huge past and a huge present and this little pinpoint of, a huge past and a huge future, but this little pinpoint that is the present. And that pinpoint seems to move forward, but there seems to be a real discrepancy of sizes of these dimensions. For the Yoruba and others, the notion of time tends more to be the present, but the present has a certain amount of width. It includes the recent past, something that is in memory as really still with us, but also the immediately foreseeable future, what we're aiming to do things in, the day that we have ahead of us. That's also part of the present. There's also a sense of the more distant past, and that's where the dead are thought to reside currently. So there's a sense in which time almost has a kind of spatial location in this way of thinking. In other words, although there is a sense in which we can say the dead lived previously, that's in a more distant sense of the past than the past that was yesterday, at least most of the time. There's also a sense in which they continue to exist. They continue to be ancestral spirits who intermediate or mediate with us between us and the gods, but at the same time, they are dead. So we can kind of map them as being in the past, but this past continues to have a kind of reality for us. What Mbiti points out is that although there is this notion of the past further back, where our ancestors lived and where the dead ones currently exist now, there's no distant future. There isn't a story like an apocalypse, he thinks, in any of the sub-Saharan African tribes. And this he finds really interesting. There isn't a kind of sense of any cataclysm that might come about. You might compare Western religious accounts. In the Hebrew Bible, there's a flood that kills virtually everyone and everything, and Noah and his family and the animals on his ark survive. You don't have anything like that in the accounts of the Yoruba or other sub-Saharan African tribes. Instead, there's a sense that time will continue to cycle. Those who are dead now and in this realm of the ancestors will come back. There's a sense in which they continue to exist in the past as well, but nevertheless, there's a simultaneous presence of the ancestor soul in new people that appear on earth, who again die and go to the realm of the ancestors. So there's a kind of double existence. You might say that this is comparable to the complication introduced by having all these different soul elements. It's a much more complex system in a way than the Western idea of here's the mind, here's the body, somehow they work together. Finally, the notion of reason, which we've said in the West is the privileged way of coming to know the most important things, is not the exclusive way of coming to know things in sub-Saharan Africa generally, or among the Yoruba particularly. Reason, of course, is important, but as I mentioned, divination is also considered to be extremely valuable. And in fact, divination is a kind of practice that is particularly important at important stages of one's life. So when one is deciding what career to pursue, say, something that is pretty important with regard to how one's life goes, divination would be appropriate. And in the case of figuring out how to interpret divination, it's a matter not really directly of reason, but a question of finding a match between an account in this traditional corpus that the person who is the diviner has memorized and knows which part is the appropriate part to present, and the person's life situation. And that's maybe a more intuitive matter than most Western philosophers would view as the main way of finding out what's really important. So we can compare the two worldviews that we've talked about in this lecture and come to realize, I think, just how idiosyncratic in some ways Western thought really is. Although I think we tend to take for granted that if something moves, something must be moving it. That isn't something that is universally believed. As we noted, the Yoruba tend to think that if something moves, that's its nature. If something moves, that indicates something about the force that inheres in it and the force that can affect other forces around it. It's a very dynamic vision of reality, where really something not moving would be more a matter of needing explanation. I mean, at death we can see that the body doesn't move, but the Yoruba have an explanation for that. The soul elements have somehow come apart. The idea that the unchanging is more true, that in order to talk about the truth we need to refer to eternal verities, which is really something that is a very common view in the West, is not thought by the Yoruba to be really the way it is at all. Instead, although they do recognize patterns that recur, it's recurrence of patterns. And what changes is really more what we notice in our everyday lives. The idea of the father or mother returning is a kind of pattern that is observed, but not in an absolutely regular way. And the world with all these dynamic forces and interactions among forces is viewed as something that we are engaged in primarily, not something that we're viewing from a distance. If you think about Aristotle talking about contemplation as being the best way to live, his notion there is that we figure out what the universal truths are. We figure out what the laws of nature are, say, for example, and we contemplate them. We recognize them everywhere around us. And this is a very contenting, satisfying way to live. The idea for the Yoruba is more that the world is full of vitality, and our best way of interacting with it is precisely to interact, to participate, to see our own nature as being forcefully engaged with other kinds of beings. The idea of the mind-body distinction in the West doesn't have the same kind of effect on the Yoruba way of thinking, even though in a sense they talk about spiritual elements and the body, precisely because the spiritual elements are associated with parts of the body. The body itself is spiritual. And although certainly the idea of several elements coming together does raise philosophical questions, how do they all get together? And once they are together, how do they work? Those could be questions that people might address. But nevertheless, the idea is we already are spiritual beings. We're full of force that God has given us, and this is our way of participating in the world. And as beings, if you are going to offer an explanation of how the parts work together, it's probably going to be a more complicated explanation than even Descartes' account would require. The idea of the person, too, in the West, as we've seen, tends to be a very individualistic notion, whereas for the Yoruba, the idea of being a person is taking a place in a community, being involved with others, perhaps recognizing that you yourself and your relatives are reincarnations of earlier members of your line, and somehow doing what you need to do in order to repay the ancestors and other members of your tribe for the possibility of your living as you are now. By comparison with the linear model of time in the West, we see a much more cyclical kind of notion, one that even allows souls to continue to cycle through. And finally, the idea of reason, as it's viewed in the West, is viewed as only one of many ways of engaging with reality. Thank you. Thank you.